Rest your eyes, traveler of time. Tonight, we follow the footsteps of a god whose power shaped both land and sea. Beneath ancient skies and along sacred coasts, his name was whispered in prayers, carved into stone, and feared in tremors. This is the story of Poseidon, ruler of the deep, master of horses, and shaker of the earth. I love to see that my hard work in building these stories is helping someone sleep and relax, or just enjoy. So take a minute to like and subscribe, because it would mean everything to me. At birth, Poseidon was swallowed whole by his father, who feared that one of his children would rise to overthrow him. Deep inside the Titan's belly, Poseidon remained hidden and silent, waiting for the fate that time would unravel. It was his brother who later came to his rescue, seeking the help of a wise goddess who knew how to twist nature's balance. With a magical elixir in hand, she tricked their father into drinking it, and one by one, the swallowed children were released. Among them came Poseidon, reborn into the world not as a helpless infant, but as a god destined to shape the oceans. During the Great War of the Titans, when the sky and earth trembled under the weight of rebellion, Poseidon stood by his brothers. To aid them in their struggle, the one-eyed craftsman of thunder and flame, the Cyclops, forged a mighty weapon for Poseidon. A trident gleaming with divine power, carved with the fury of waves. Armed with this weapon, Poseidon fought alongside his brothers, pushing the elder gods back, breaking their hold on the cosmos, and casting them down into the dark prison of Tartaros. After their victory, the three brothers stood over the conquered world and cast lots to divide their rule. To Zeus fell the sky, to Hades the underworld, and to Poseidon the vast and restless sea. He accepted his fate and made the deep waters his kingdom, commanding waves, winds, and all creatures beneath the surface. But his trials did not end with the Titans. When the giants rose against the gods, storming the heights of Olympus with reckless strength, Poseidon met them with thunderous rage. He crushed one of the great enemies, Polybotes, not with a blade, but with the might of earth itself, burying him beneath the island of Kos, where he remains trapped. Later, Poseidon vied for the favor of a great city, entering into contest with the goddess of wisdom. As a gift to its people, he struck the ground and created the world's first horse, a symbol of power and speed. But the city's king denied him the prize, favoring her gift instead. In fury, Poseidon afflicted the land with drought, drying the rivers and hardening the earth until the people felt the weight of their ruler's choice. In another moment, darker and clouded with grief, he crossed paths with his sister as she wandered in sorrow searching for her daughter. In the form of a horse, he pursued her, not with kindness, but with violent desire, and from that encounter were born strange offspring, tied to both the wild and the divine. Poseidon's passions were many, and he often took the shapes of animals or water itself to reach those he desired. He approached the fearsome Medusa and transformed her fate, seduced others like Tyro and Amymone, and embraced Aethra, who would give birth to one of Greece's greatest heroes. He moved through the world as a wave crashing on unknown shores, touching mortal lives with force and sometimes cruelty. At one time, he lent his hands to build the towering walls of Troy, shaping stones with strength and skill. But when the king refused to honor their agreement and withheld the promised reward, Poseidon answered with wrath. From the deep, he summoned a terrible sea monster and let it loose upon the land, a beast of vengeance for a broken oath. Much later, as the hero of Ithaca sailed home from war, Poseidon's rage turned once again to vengeance. His son, a giant with a single eye, had been blinded by the traveler, and in return, Poseidon hurled storms across the sea, scattering ships and extending the journey far beyond what fate had planned. The god's power stretched across the world, and in every story, his trident marked the will of the sea. The trident itself, his most sacred symbol, was a weapon, a tool, and a signal of his mastery. Sometimes he held a great stone, crawling with sea creatures, or wore a simple robe with a flowing cloak that caught the wind like sails on a ship. Often, he was crowned not with gold but with wild celery or a headband, showing that his glory came from the untamed elements. He appeared in statues and paintings holding these symbols, trident in hand, cloak billowing behind him, a god of relentless strength. His sacred animals were just as mighty and wild. The bull stood for his fury, the horse for his speed, the dolphin for his command over the seas. Some say he rode in a chariot drawn by creatures with the upper body of horses and tails like fish, gliding through the ocean faster than the eye could follow. The bull he favored most was the one from Crete, the father of the beast known as the Minotaur, and it bore his strength and stubborn power. The pine tree and the stalks of wild celery were dear to him, growing near the places where his games were held. These plants crowned the victors at the Isthmian Games, reminding all who saw them of the god's reach from land to sea. Every part of his story echoed the sound of crashing waves, the rumble of the earth, and the cry of animals running wild beneath the open sky. His presence could be felt in the shudder of ground, the pull of the tide, and the fierce wind that carried ships off course. Poseidon was more than a god of the sea. He was force itself, never still, always watching, always ready to rise. Poseidon, the god of the Mediterranean Sea, was closely connected to all forms of flowing water, with his name believed to be linked to words meaning ocean, river, and stream. As a powerful figure among the Olympian gods, he was born to the Titans, Kronos and Rhea, making him a direct sibling to Zeus, Hades, Hera, Hestia, and Demeter, and a grandchild of the primordial deities Ouranos, the sky, and Gaia, the earth. Like his siblings, Poseidon's early life was marked by tragedy, for Kronos, fearing a prophecy that one of his children would overthrow him, swallowed each child whole upon birth. Poseidon was one of those consumed, but later, during the rise of the Olympians, he was released from the Titan's belly. There were other versions of his birth too. Some said Rhea, desperate to save him, tricked Kronos by hiding the infant Poseidon among a flock of lambs and presenting a young horse as a substitute for the god, which Kronos then swallowed, believing it to be his child. The place where this event supposedly took place, near Mantinea, became known as the Lamb's Well or Arne. In another telling, Poseidon's nurse was also named Arne, who, when questioned by Kronos, claimed ignorance of the god's whereabouts, giving the town of Arne its name. Still others believed he was raised by the mysterious Telchines, sea-dwelling craftspeople with magical powers, at Rhea's request. Despite the varying versions, all agreed he was eventually freed and rose to power among the gods. After the fall of the Titans, the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, cast lots to divide the cosmos. The sky went to Zeus, the underworld to Hades, and Poseidon was granted dominion over the sea. He married a sea goddess, Amphitrite, the eldest daughter of Nereus, himself a child of the sea god Pontos, and through this union, Poseidon's authority over the oceans was cemented. Their child was Triton, a god with the upper body of a man and the tail of a fish, known for his conch shell horn that could calm or stir the seas. But Poseidon's family extended far beyond this sacred marriage. He fathered many offspring, both mortal and divine, including the Cyclops Polyphemus and the giant Antaios. He was also the sire of magical beings, such as the winged horse Pegasus and the immortal horse Arion, and he fathered numerous human rulers and warriors, among them Theseus, a famed hero, and Bellerophontes, the slayer of the Chimera. His reach extended through myth and mortal bloodlines alike. In ancient Greek art, Poseidon was often shown with creatures and plants sacred to him. His animals included the dolphin, a symbol of his gentler sea aspects, the hippocamp, a fantastical beast with the upper body of a horse and the lower body of a fish, which often pulled his chariot across the waves, and, of course, the mighty horse, a creature deeply associated with the god, perhaps born from his stormy temperament and his role in creating the first horse. His sacred plants were the pine tree and wild celery. Pine, strong and evergreen, might reflect the steadfast nature of his rule over the sea, while wild celery was used to crown victors in the Isthmian Games, held in his honor, just as olive wreaths crowned the winners of contests for Zeus. Poseidon's attributes were distinct and widely recognized. His most iconic symbol was the trident, a three-pronged spear crafted by the Cyclops during the war against the Titans. With it, he could stir storms, shatter the earth, and summon tidal waves. Sometimes he carried a large stone encrusted with sea life, crabs, fish, octopi, showing his deep bond with the ocean floor. He appeared clothed in a flowing robe, or sometimes nearly nude, with a cloak draped around his shoulders, his head adorned with a simple band or a crown of celery leaves. These elements, trident, boulder, wreath, cloak, each told parts of his story, appearing in temples, statues, and vase paintings across the Greek world. Poseidon's power lay in the fluid element, the ever-moving, ever-changing sea, and his influence reached far beyond the shoreline. He could cause earthquakes with a strike of his trident and raise floods to cover the land. In early epics, Poseidon was nearly equal in dignity to Zeus, but often portrayed as less powerful. Still, he was bold, proud, and quick to anger, and when challenged, even by his brother, he did not back down easily. In one moment from the epic poems, he responded to Zeus's harsh words with threats of his own. Not out of insolence, but out of wounded pride, showing that even among gods, power did not always come without struggle. His presence was felt wherever the sea reached, from the still waters of the Mediterranean to the distant edges of the earth, from the birth of strange creatures to the lives of kings and heroes. And even though many feared his storms and earthquakes, they honored him with temples and sacrifices, with games and songs, because the sea, though dangerous, brought life and trade and fish to the people, just as it brought fury and loss. In myth and memory, Poseidon remained a figure of might and movement, of deep oceans and shaking earth, of wild horses and calm dolphins, a god whose voice thundered in the waves and whose anger split the land. Being the ruler of the sea, Poseidon held immense power, yet his story was filled with the moments of conflict, pride, and divine action that shaped the course of mortal and immortal lives alike. Though he was brother to the king of the gods, there were times when tension rose between them, and once, in the company of two other Olympians, he joined in a bold plan to bind Zeus in chains. This attempt to overthrow their brother was daring and dangerous, and though the plan ultimately failed, it showed that Poseidon's spirit was not always one of submission. Still, there were other moments when he yielded, when he stepped back and accepted Zeus's rule with a more obedient heart, showing that his pride was not without limit. Beneath the waves, hidden deep in the waters near Aegae in Euboea, Poseidon's palace lay in splendor. This home, unreachable by mortals, was where he kept his sacred horses, creatures unlike any other, with hooves of shining bronze and manes that gleamed like gold in the sunlight. With these mighty beings, he rode across the sea in a grand chariot, and wherever the wheels of that divine cart touched the waters, the waves fell still, the wind calmed, and the sea turned to glass. Sea monsters, creatures from the depths of myth and mystery, would rise and gather, not in fear, but in playful welcome, surrounding his chariot and dancing through the waves as he passed. Most often, Poseidon himself fastened the horses to his chariot, but there were times when his queen from the sea, Amphitrite, helped him prepare for the journey. And though his heart and home belonged to the ocean, Poseidon was no stranger to Olympus. He appeared often in the halls of the gods, taking his place among the immortals when council was called or conflict arose. His power was never far from the land above, even if his throne stood beneath the sea. Long ago, Poseidon joined with another great god to build the walls of a city that would one day become the center of one of the greatest wars known to myth. Together, they raised the mighty defenses of Troy for its king, Laomedon. Stone by stone, they shaped the city's strength, and because of Poseidon's hand in its creation, Troy came to be called by names that remembered him. But when the work was done, the reward promised to the builders was denied. The king not only refused to pay them, but drove them away with threats and scorn. Angered by this betrayal, Poseidon called forth a beast from the sea, a monster so fierce that it threatened to devour the king's own daughter. Though the creature was slain before it could complete its terrible task, the god's wrath was not easily forgotten. From that moment on, Poseidon, like the goddess of marriage who shared his anger, carried an unshakable hatred for the people of Troy. His fury burned so deeply that even Aeneas, noble son of that city, found no mercy from the god. So when the time came for war to fall upon Troy, Poseidon was ready. Despite his general favor for the Greek people, his actions in the war were driven by old wounds and lasting grudges. He watched the battles unfold from afar, standing on the highlands of Thrace, a distant observer cloaked in divine power. But often he stepped down from his distant perch and entered the fight himself. Taking on the form of a mortal warrior, he walked among the Greeks, giving them strength, lifting their spirits, and urging them to press forward. Even when Zeus, his brother, supported the Trojans, Poseidon did not hold back. And when the time came for the gods to choose sides freely, without Zeus's restraint, Poseidon cast his lot fully with the Greeks. The earth quaked with each step he took, the ground shook beneath his presence, and his power was felt far and wide. His opponent on the battlefield was none other than Apollo, the archer god, who stood with the Trojans. But even as the two faced one another, Apollo hesitated, unwilling to raise his hand against the one who had helped build Troy's very walls. Still, the war raged, and Poseidon's anger never cooled. Later, in the long journey of a single man trying to return home, the god's rage took another form. Odysseus, the clever hero of the Greek armies, earned Poseidon's wrath not through war, but through an act of pride and defiance. On his voyage home, he crossed paths with a giant, a one-eyed son of Poseidon born from the sea nymph Thoosa. Odysseus blinded this cyclops to escape death, and though it saved his men, it also sealed his fate. Poseidon, furious over the injury to his son, made the sea an enemy to the hero. Again and again, storms scattered his ships, drove him off course, and kept him from reaching his homeland. Even when other gods favored the hero, Poseidon's will delayed the journey. He stood as the final obstacle, not in malice for the man himself, but out of fierce love for his child and deep pride in his own name. Throughout the poems and stories, Poseidon was a god of strength, pride, and deep emotions, capable of great works and powerful vengeance, riding through the sea with waves parting before him, dwelling in a palace far below the surface, yet never distant from the affairs of gods and men. As the god of the Mediterranean Sea, he was known for his power to gather thick clouds above the water and stir the sky with violent storms. Yet he also had the ability to calm the waves and guide ships safely to shore, granting a smooth journey to those who honored him or found favor in his eyes. All other deities of the sea bowed to his command, recognizing his absolute authority over the realm of the ocean. Because the sea surrounds the land from every direction, wrapping it like a great cloak of water, he came to be known as the one who holds the earth, and by the same force, he could shake it, moving the ground beneath human feet with a mighty tremor. These roles earned him names that reflected his deep connection to both the sea and the earth holder and the earth shaker. Beyond the sea and land, he was also closely linked to horses. He was believed to have created the very first horse, and from this act, he became the patron of horsemanship, teaching people how to control these strong animals using bridles, guiding their strength with human skill. He was the protector of horse races, watching over the games where chariots thundered through the course. Often, he was shown either riding on horseback himself or standing tall in a chariot pulled by 2 or 4 horses, powerful beasts that reflected his wild and untamed nature. Because of this, he was given titles that connected him directly to horses, names that meant horse god or horse lord. Riders and charioteers prayed to him for speed and victory, knowing that his favor could mean the difference between triumph and defeat. His bond with horses was so strong that, in one tale, he took the form of a horse to deceive another goddess, showing that his shape-shifting powers could take on the very animal he created. The origin of the horse itself was told through a story of rivalry. When he and another goddess competed to win the honor of naming the great city of Attica, the gods decided that whoever could give the most useful gift to mankind would win the right. To impress the gods and the people, he struck the earth with his trident, and from that mark a powerful horse emerged, the first of its kind, strong, fast, and full of energy. But the goddess offered something else, a tree of olives, a gift of peace and nourishment. The gods chose her gift as the greater one, and so the city was named in her honor. Still, Poseidon's act remained legendary, and many believed he first created the horse not in that city, but in Thessaly, a land known for his horses. There he also gave magical horses to a great king, animals whose speed and beauty stood out among all others. The trident was the ultimate symbol of his might. This 3-pointed spear was more than a weapon. It was the key to his control over nature. With it, he could break through mountains, split rocks, stir up storms, calm the seas, and shake the entire earth. The stories say that whenever he drove it into the ground or raised it high, the world responded. Some ancient writers believed that his name and his worship were brought to Greece from Libya, but others held that he was born from the earliest beliefs of the Greek people, a figure who began as a force of water that gave life to the land. From this origin, it was not hard to imagine him ruling the sea, since the sea brings both life and destruction, just like water on the land. What makes his tales even more striking is how often he fought with other gods for control over certain lands. He never simply accepted boundaries but challenged them again and again. In one famous story, he tried to take Attica by force. He slammed his trident into the top of the Acropolis, and from that spot, salt water sprang up in a small pool. But the goddess planted a tree instead, one that gave olives. When the gods judged the contest, they decided that the olive tree was a better gift, so they gave the land to her. Furious, Poseidon flooded the country, sending water rushing across the fields in anger over his loss. These tales repeated across many parts of Greece. Poseidon's need to claim land to leave his mark and to challenge others for recognition showed how deeply he wished to be seen as a god of more than just the sea. His reach was wide, and he often left behind signs of his power: a spring, a lake, a flood, or a new animal. His temper was fierce, but his presence always brought change, shaping the land and the sea together. His name, his trident, and his horses were known throughout the ancient world, and even though he often lost contest to other gods, his power was never ignored. From the sea that crashes on the shores to the horses galloping in races, to the earth shaking beneath the feet of men, his force was present in the daily lives of the people who prayed to him and told his stories. With Athena, he once argued over the possession of Troezena, and by the will of the highest god, they were commanded to share the land, each taking part of it, bound by divine decision rather than personal victory. In another place, he clashed with the sun god over the rule of Corinth, and in that contest, the wide lands of the isthmus and the surrounding region were granted to him, while the sun god was given only the Acropolis. Elsewhere, in Argolis, he quarreled with the goddess of marriage over who would be its divine protector. The judgment was made by 3 river gods, Inachus, Tephisus, and Asterion, and they ruled in favor of the goddess, which made him furious. In retaliation, he dried up the waters of their rivers, stripping them of their flow and turning the land barren in his anger. He did not accept defeat easily, not even from those who once flowed freely across the land. In yet another instance, he disputed with his own brother for the possession of Aegina, and later with the god of wine for the island of Naxos. In the sacred land of Delphi, it was once told that he shared ownership with the earth goddess. But when another god took possession of the shrine, he was offered the island of Caloria as compensation, a trade that marked a shifting of powers across sacred places. His tales continued into the deeper myths of war and divine struggle. When the Titans rose in ancient rebellion, he stood beside his brothers and fought against their father and the old gods. In the later war with the giants, he chased one of them across the open sea, following the enemy as far as the island of Kos, where he lifted the very island itself and hurled it down upon the giant, burying him under stone and soil forever. When the wild and chaotic centaurs fled from the hero of strength, he struck them down under the weight of a mountain on the island of Leucosia, leaving them buried beneath the place where the Sirenes sang. He once desired to marry a sea nymph, and another great god sought her too. But when the goddess of divine law foretold that the son born from her would surpass his father in greatness, he chose to withdraw, giving up his claim rather than risk being undone by his own child. In one tale, when the god of war was caught in a net spun by the god of fire and craft, it was he who stepped forward to ask for his release. But later, when that same god of war took the life of his son, Haliarothius, he brought the matter before the ancient court of the Areopagus, seeking justice for the death. Another time, when the king of Crete asked for a sign of favor, he caused a bull to rise from the sea, a strong and perfect beast that was to be offered as sacrifice. But the king, drawn by greed or pride, hid the bull among his own herds, thinking he could deceive the god. In response, he caused the king's daughter to fall under a strange and unnatural desire for the bull, setting into motion events that brought suffering and disgrace to the royal house. He had many children, some through divine unions, others through mortal women. Among these was Periclymenus, who was either born of his line or blessed by him directly, and to him he gave the ability to change form at will. taking on many shapes as he pleased. Though his wife was the queen of the sea, and she bore him 3 children: Triton, who was half man and half fish, Rhode, connected to the island that bore her name, and Benthesichaime, whose name spoke of deep-sea beauty. His legacy was far larger, for he fathered a great host of others. His children were giants, kings, warriors, nymphs, and creatures of both land and sea. They carried his strength and his temper, shaping many of the stories that followed. Across the lands and islands of Greece and into southern Italy, he was known by many names. Each name spoke of a different tale, a different place, or a different face of his power. Some names called him the Earth Shaker, others the ruler of horses, others the Lord of Waves. His temple stood near the sea, on high cliffs, deep in valleys and beside rivers. His statues bore the trident, his most famous symbol, and worshippers poured out wine and sacrificed bulls in his honor. Though other gods may have had softer stories, his were always filled with struggle, with storms, with rivalry and revenge, and with moments of quiet command over the forces that surrounded the world. His name was carried by sailors on ships, carved into stone by kings, and whispered in prayers when the ground began to move. All these stories wove together the image of a god who did not merely belong to one place, but who claimed the right to all places: seas, lands, islands, cities, skies, and who met every challenge with the force of waves, the strike of his trident, and the will of the deep. In Peloponnesus, a region rich with temples and sacred lands, he was worshipped with deep reverence, and the land itself was often referred to as his dwelling place, the oikaterion of the god, marking it as a center of his divine presence. His worship also flourished in the coastal cities of the Ionian Greeks, where the sea ruled life and trade, and the salt air carried his name with every tide. In these lands, sacrifices were made to honor him, and the most common offerings were black and white bulls, symbols of strength and purity. These sacrifices were not simple rituals, but powerful acts of devotion, performed with ceremony and fear, for the god who shook the earth and ruled the seas was known to be both generous and terrible. In addition to bulls, wild boars and rams were also offered to him, especially in times when storms threatened or voyages began. In the land of Argolis, the devotion took an even deeper form, where bridled horses, powerful and bound by leather and bronze, were thrown into the sacred well of Dian, a dark and deep place that served as a link between the land and the god beneath the waters. These horses, strong and trained, were given not as symbols but as true offerings, meant to join his divine herd beneath the waves. On the narrow strip of land that joined the two seas, the Corinthian Isthmus, races were held in his name, where horses and chariots raced in thunderous circles, dust rising into the air, wheels spinning fast, and the crowd cheering in honor of the god who created the horse and mastered its strength. Another great celebration, the Pannonia, brought together all the Ionian people near the slopes of Mycale. There they gathered under the open sky, united in one great festival, singing songs and making offerings to the ruler of the sea, asking him for peace on the water, strength on the land, and safety in all their undertakings. In the world of art, he was easily known, for his symbols were fixed and familiar. The dolphin that swam beside him, the horse that carried his will, and the trident that he held with firm command. These symbols appeared in paintings, carvings, sculptures, and pottery, and wherever one of them appeared, his name followed. Artists often placed him among other sea spirits and divine companions, his queen Amphitrite at his side, the Tritons blowing their shells, the Nereids riding the waves, dolphins leaping joyfully, and mortal heroes like the twins of Sparta or the rider of the winged horse who once pleased him. He stood among them not as a distant god, but as a ruler surrounded by his domain. In these depictions, his face did not carry the calm and unshaken majesty of his brother in the sky, for the sea is never still. Sometimes he was shown in violent rage, the sea boiling around him, his beard wild, his trident raised, and at other times he stood in quiet power, the waters calm, the horses at rest, the air heavy with salt and silence. The artists who shaped his image knew that the god, like the ocean itself, could never be just one thing. The Romans later called him by another name, and though they gave him a Latin title, they borrowed his stories, his powers, his symbols, and his place among the gods. They called him Neptunus, but the image remained the same. The god of the sea, the lord of waves and storms, the one whose trident could break mountains and still tempests. In the old hymns of Greece, his praises were sung with solemn tones and powerful words. In one of the oldest hymns, written in the style of epic poetry, the singer began with a prayer to him, calling him the great god who moves the earth and rules the barren sea, the one who dwells in the depths, but also watches over the sacred mountains and wide lands. He was hailed as the tamer of horses, the savior of ships, and the holder of the land beneath all life. The prayer asked for kindness and safe passage, asking the dark-haired god to help those who sailed under his watch. In another hymn from a different tradition, he was called upon in verses thick with rhythm and praise. He was described as the ruler of the deep, holding the ground within his liquid grasp, seated at the bottom of the sea, his power stretching to the farthest edge of the ocean. In his hand, he held the mighty trident of bronze, and the waters obeyed his will. His dark hair dripped with salt, and his voice echoed across the waves, making the sea roar and tremble. As he rode across the water, his horses split the foam, and the monsters of the sea played before him, not in fear, but in joy. His domain, called the third realm after sky and underworld, was his by fate. He was pleased when the beasts of the ocean swam freely, when ships were guided by gentle winds, when peace and health spread across the world like a steady tide. The hymn asked him to keep the land steady, to fill sails with wind, to bring peace and prosperity, and to bless the people with good harvests and safe travels. These songs, written by voices long lost to time, still carried the memory of the god who shaped the sea, ruled the storms, and watched over both land and water. Arion, the poet saved by a dolphin, wrote a hymn of thanks to the god of the sea, a hymn that told not only of gratitude, but also of the deep bond between the god and the creatures of the ocean. This hymn spoke of Poseidon, highest among the gods, lord of the endless waters, holder of the golden trident that shimmered in the deep shaker of the earth who stirred the swelling brine. Around him swam the finned creatures, forming a living ring that danced and twisted in joy, their bodies flicking and leaping as if to music, moving with grace and speed. These were the creatures of the sea, snub-nosed and fast, like hounds of the water with bristling backs, running through waves as others did across the land. Among them, the dolphins shone brightest, not just in form but in spirit, for they were said to love music, drawn to it like flowers to sunlight. They were the nurtured children of the sea nymphs, the Nereids, born of Amphitrite, and they carried Arion across the sea when treacherous men threw him from their ship into the rolling purple waves. They lifted him gently onto their backs, and as they moved through the sea's furrow, They brought him to safety on the rocky shores of Tainaron, across the waters of Sicily to the land of Pelops, following a path no human had walked, guided only by the sea's rhythm and their silent devotion. These dolphins, the sea's gentle runners, were more than mere beasts. They were companions to the divine, and their act of mercy became legend. In another tale, when the god sought a wife, he chose Amphitrite, the dark-eyed daughter of the old sea god. But she fled from him, not wishing to be taken, hiding in the halls of the deep beneath the wide world. It was the dolphins again who found her and revealed her hiding place. For this service they were honored forever, and the god, with his dark flowing hair, found her and carried her away, making her his queen. Though she had resisted, she was brought into his golden home beneath the waves, and from their union came Triton, a god of the sea's deep places, who ruled the waters with his parents, living with them in a house of gold, a place of wonder and power. The dolphins, for their part in this divine story, were raised to the stars, placed in the heavens as a constellation, so that their loyalty would be remembered for all time. One tale said that a dolphin named Delphin had not only found Amphitrite, but also persuaded her, speaking gently and guiding her heart toward the god, and for this, the dolphin was placed among the stars, a shining form that would be seen in the night sky forever. Their role was not forgotten. The old poem spoke of Poseidon and his queen, of their marriage, and of the ocean child born to them, and of how the god, with the power to stir seas and calm storms, was never alone in the deep. His companions were the dolphins, the Nereids, the creatures of the current and the music of the waves. Even among the ancient poets, the image of the god was never far from his sea-formed bride, who sat at his side with her gold-spun hair and her quiet power, spinning her thread like the tide. The old songs praised the god who roared like the sea, who ruled from beneath, and who lived not alone, but with a wife who had once run from him and a son who ruled beside him. The sea held their story, from the purple swells where the poet was rescued, to the deep halls of Oceanus where Amphitrite had once hidden, to the high stars where the dolphin was fixed. The god, his wife, his child, the dolphins, and the song sung by those who survived the sea. All were part of the same story, a tale told in waves and winds, hymns and stars, where every leap of a dolphin echoed the past, and every roll of thunder beneath the sea recalled the god's name. In the lovely house beneath the sea, his wife, the one with ox-like eyes, cared for him with quiet devotion. She was his dear partner, and on a day marked by significance, she wrapped around him a cloak dyed deep purple and placed upon his thick hair a flawless garland. That garland, rich with the scent and colour of roses, had once been a gift to her on their wedding day, offered by the goddess of desire herself, whose trickery and charm touched all unions. From this marriage children were born. Triton, who ruled the ocean's depths with the sound of his conch and the force of the tides, and Rhode, linked forever to the island that bore her name. Another daughter was Benthsikimi, whose name meant deep wave, and who reflected the very heart of the ocean, its beauty, its depth, and its mystery. In another story told among the stars and waves, a boy descended into the sea, and a host of dolphins, swimming in great numbers, rose to meet him. These creatures tumbled and spun across the surface, their joy apparent, and carried him through the gentle waves to the sea nymphs. There he retrieved a ring and a crown, symbols of lineage and connection. The crown had come from the goddess of the deep herself, the wife of the sea god, showing that she, too, had a role in guiding destinies and confirming truths hidden beneath the surface. But not all of his stories were filled with joy or peace. There was another tale told in Arcadia, a story of pursuit and transformation, as one goddess wandered in search of her lost daughter. The god of the sea saw her and followed, filled with desire. To escape him, she took the form of a mare and mingled with other horses grazing in the quiet fields. But he recognized her trick and in response transformed into a stallion. In that form, he joined with her, and from their union came a child. At first, she was angry, shamed by what had happened, but later, she bathed in the river Ladon and let go of her anger. From that meeting were born 2 children, a daughter whose name was kept secret from all but the initiated, and a horse called Arion, unlike any other. Arion, swift and divine, was spoken of in verses and epics, praised for his unmatched speed and strength. In one tale, a king fled a doomed city dressed in rags, and beside him ran Arion, the dark-maned horse of divine blood. While some said the horse was born of the earth, others insisted the sea god was his true father. In Arcadia, a place of sacred groves and hidden names, the people spoke of Despoin, a goddess they worshipped above all others, and they said she was the daughter of the sea god and the wandering goddess. They called her by a title rather than her true name, keeping it hidden, just as they kept the truths of their rituals veiled from outsiders. Near her sanctuary stood altars to the horse god, for they knew him as the father of Despoin, and they placed his name among the most sacred. High on Mount Olympus, the land held the memory of these stories, where the presence of the god lingered, not just in the waves, but in the soil, the trees, the animals, and the names spoken softly in worship. The god of the sea was not only ruler of oceans, but also father of children both divine and earthly, giver of gifts and taker of forms, who could chase across the land as a stallion or carry a boy through the sea with the help of dolphins, who could shake the earth and comfort his queen with a crown of roses, who was honored in hymns and remembered in garlands, in rivers, in altars, and in the names that were both spoken and left unspoken. In a shadowed region of Arcadia, there lay a cave sacred to the goddess of grain, a cave known to the people as the resting place of the goddess in her darkest grief. And in this place, she was worshipped under the name Black. The people of Phigalia accepted the tale told by their neighbors from Thelpusa, that the god of the sea had once pursued and caught her, but they told it differently. According to them, she did not bear a horse from this union, but a daughter, the one the Arcadians called Despoin. After this, they said, her heart was filled with sorrow and rage, not only at the act of the god, but also at the loss of her daughter, who had been taken to the underworld. She dressed herself in black robes and shut herself within the cave, vanishing from the eyes of the world and refusing to return. In her absence, the crops withered. The fruits of the earth began to perish, and famine spread among the mortals. No god knew where she had gone or how to bring her back, until the wild god of the hills, wandering through Arcadia in the pursuit of game, came upon her at last. Roaming across mountain after mountain, he reached Mount Olympus, where he caught sight of the goddess cloaked in her dark robes. Seeing her sorrow and solitude, he brought news of her whereabouts to the king of the gods. Then the ancient fates were sent to speak with her. These beings, older than many gods, held power over destiny, and she listened to them. They spoke words that calmed her grief, and in time, she let go of her wrath and allowed the land to bloom again. But in another telling, there was more darkness. It was said that while she mourned by the sacred waters of the Styx, the god of the sea intruded upon her sorrow. Enraged by his approach, she transformed into a mare to escape him. But even this disguise did not spare her, for he too became a stallion and joined with her. Afterwards, she arrived at a fountain in her transformed state, and because she hated what had happened, she cursed the place by turning its waters black. The spring became a place of grief and memory, its darkness a symbol of her pain. This fountain, once clear, was sacred to the sea god, but now it held her bitterness. Others spoke of her golden hair and how, in the form of a horse, she suffered the god's desire. Her child from this act was Aryan, a horse unlike any other, swift, dark-maned and divine, but also born from that moment in the land of Arcadia, was a daughter whose true name was never spoken, known only by the title Depoine. She was worshipped with secrecy, and her sanctuary stood not far from groves and altars to her father, the horse god, whose name was carved on stone in reverence. The tales of the god's desires did not end there, for in a land far across the sea, by the red shores of Erythea, another story unfolded, one filled with flowers, ruin, and transformation. There, amid spring blossoms and a soft meadow, the sea god approached one of the three Gorgon sisters. Her name was Medusa, and though her sisters were ageless and immortal, she alone was bound to mortality. In that quiet field beyond the river of the world, he lay with her. Some said it happened with tenderness among the flowers. Others whispered it was within a sacred temple where no such act should occur. It was said that the goddess of wisdom saw what took place, and ashamed of what had been done in her shrine, she turned away and covered her eyes. But she did not let the act go unanswered. In anger, she changed Medusa's hair, once beautiful, into a nest of writhing snakes, a punishment that cursed the once lovely maiden into a monstrous form. In another account, the poet said Medusa, the mother of winged Pegasus, was approached like a bird by the god, and from their meeting came children born not in life but in death. For when a hero later struck off her head, two beings leapt from her blood. One was Chrysaor, who held a golden blade, and the other was Pegasus, the winged horse, destined to fly and to serve the gods. These children did not grow from a womb, but from the moment of her end, springing full-formed from the wound. The Gorgons, who lived beyond the edge of the world near the singing nymphs, had long been feared, but only Medusa met such a fate. Her story was remembered not only for its sorrow, but also for what came from it, a horse that flew and a warrior god. All these tales wove together into a single thread, a god of the sea who shifted forms and crossed realms, who joined with goddesses and mortals, who fathered beings of land and water, and whose name was spoken with reverence and fear. From caves in Arcadia to meadows beyond the river, from black fountains to distant seas, his presence left behind children, curses, and legends, remembered in silence, in stone, and in stars. And the winged horse, Pegasus, was so named from the springs, Pegae, of the great river Okeanos, for it was near those flowing waters that the creature's origin was tied, and where its mother, the mortal Gorgon, was believed to have been born. When the hero known for slaying monsters mounted the winged horse, it was not merely an act of courage, but the joining of man and myth. For Pegasus was born not from any normal womb, but from the severed body of Medusa, who had once lain with the god of the sea in a field of blooming flowers. According to the ancient accounts, when the warrior Perseus, aided by divine guidance, approached the sleeping Gorgones, he kept his gaze fixed on the reflection of his bronze shield, so as not to look directly into the deadly eyes of Medusa. And as she slept, her snakes coiled in stillness, he struck, and with one clean blow, he beheaded her. It was in that moment, when her head was severed and her life ended, that from her neck sprang two beings, Pegasus, the winged horse whose hooves would later touch both heaven and earth, and Chrysaor, the warrior with a golden blade, who would father yet another legend. Both were born not as ordinary children, but as full-formed spirits of divine origin, brought forth from the mixture of mortal death and divine blood. Many spoke of how Pegasus leapt from her neck, his wings already wide, soaring into the sky as if he had waited within her for the moment of release. Others described how the body, swollen with life, had been heavy with its twin burden, and how the blade became the midwife that brought them forth. Pegasus was born from a neck stained red, a first fruit of a monstrous womb, and his name would echo through the ages. Ancient poets called the slayer of Medusa a harvester, not of crops, but of terrible life, one who reaped not wheat, but snake-haired flesh, whose blade cut through fate itself and delivered children from a cursed body. One writer said the decapitated neck was like a field, and the blade a sickle, reaping a strange and divine harvest. Another said the mother had been pregnant with Pegasus, still carrying the unborn horse within her as she died, and so the slicing of her throat was not just death, but also birth. Pegasus, the swift flyer, would carry heroes and be remembered in the stars. Chrysaor, his brother, would wield a golden sword, and Father Geryon, the triple-bodied giant. The father of both was the god of the sea, whose power and desire had once reached even to a Gorgon. The tale of Medusa's fall echoed across the lands, her blood staining the rock, her head held high by the one who had slain her, and from that moment of violence, two new lives began. But the god stories continued beyond the Gorgon. In the Aegean Sea, he was also linked to another goddess, one of beauty and desire, born from the sea's foam. After the affair between her and the god of war was revealed, and they were caught together by the god of fire, the sea god played a role in securing their release. As the tale was told, the two lovers had been trapped in a net of invisible chains and left on display before the other gods, shamed and helpless. Yet the god of the sea spoke up, offering a promise and calling for mercy. It was said that from this act of kindness, a bond was formed between him and the goddess of love, and she showed him gratitude. This connection between them became more than a moment of rescue. It became an affair, whispered of in ancient commentaries, another thread in the wide tapestry of his many loves. Across the oceans and the skies, the god of the sea left behind more than storms and salt. He left stories of passion, of monsters, of winged horses, and of sorrow and birth interwoven. From springs by the river of the world, to caves by the Libyan rocks, from the broken neck of a cursed maiden, to the flight of a horse whose hooves stirred the clouds, his presence lingered. His union with Medusa, though shadowed by pain, brought forth a creature that would soar beyond its origin, and his hand, in the fate of love and war, tied him to gods beyond the sea. All these pieces, the neck, the blood, the flight, the chains, the lovers, the promises, formed a single current, a wave of myth that could not be stopped, and which continues, like Pegasus himself, to fly across time. Bed and there lay down, and in that moment of comfort, the two were caught by the invisible trap, for the cunning chains of the god of fire, carefully woven with craft and patience, sprang to life and held them fast. The two lovers, tangled together in secrecy and desire, suddenly found themselves unable to move, for the clever work of the smith had encircled them. Their limbs were locked, their bodies pinned, and in the silence that followed, they understood fully what had happened. There was no escape, no chance to deny or flee, only the truth laid bare before the gods. Soon, the god who had forged the trap arrived, stepping slowly toward the scene, and his voice rose with bitterness and pain as he summoned the other immortals to witness what had been hidden. The gods came in great number, walking across the brazen floor of the house, filling the air with their footsteps and murmurings. Some laughed, some spoke in surprise, and others watched in silence. But among them, one did not laugh. The god of the sea soared apart from the rest, his face stern, his voice serious, as he turned to the one who held the key to the trap. He pleaded not with scorn but with urgency, asking that the bound god of war be set free. He offered his word before all, vowing that a fair price would be paid, that justice would be honored, and that the penalty would not be ignored. His words, spoken clearly and solemnly, hung heavy in the hall, and the plea was not made in defense of desire, but in recognition of dignity. Elsewhere, in the praise of poetic verse, a daughter was named, a child of beauty born from the goddess of love. Her name was sung as Rhode, maiden of the sea, destined to wed the sun god and dwell upon the island that carried her name. Her story, though small, was remembered as part of the lineage of brightness and affection that flowed from the goddess, whose affairs and blessings touched land and sea alike. Yet the sea god's love stretched beyond the known and reached even into the hidden tides. For there was once among the rocks and pure waters of the deep a creature known as Nereids, small in size, born from the sea in places untouched by sun or storm. Nereids lived near sunken reefs and resting stones, in water so clear that it reflected the sky. 2 stories were told about this being, and though short, they added sweetness to the long tale of the sea god's heart. Among many daughters of the old sea god, there was one son, and it was said that he was greatly loved by the lord of the sea. Their love was not fleeting but returned equally, and from this love the idea of mutual affection, Anteros, was born. Nereids did not only love the sea god in silence. He swam at his side, he shared his journey, and when the god drove his chariot across the waves, it was not the dolphins, nor the fishes, nor the tritons who kept pace, but Nereids alone, gliding beside the chariot, swift and graceful. As the god's horses galloped over the surface of the sea, their hooves splashing sprays of silver, the waves parted, the sea bowed, and Nereids remained beside him, never left behind, always near. And because of this, the god made sure that Nereids was honored, not just for his beauty or loyalty, but for his skill, for his unmatched speed, for the way he moved through water as if born from it. But not all gods looked on with favor. The sun god, watching from above, saw Nereids racing alongside the waves, and something stirred in him, some anger, some jealousy, some feeling the story does not name. And so, without warning, the sun god changed the boy's form. The body that once swam beside the sea god was turned into a shell, small, coiled, and spiral in shape. This transformation, unexplained and unprovoked, left only a delicate creature behind, a shellfish that clung to rocks and lived in silence. The reason for this punishment was never told, and those who remembered the tale could only guess. Perhaps it was rivalry between sun and sea. Perhaps it was something more. But whatever the cause, the boy who had swum beside a god, who had parted waves with grace and raced beyond dolphins, now lived as a shell hidden beneath the waves. And even in that form, he was beautiful. His shell shimmered in the light, and the place where he was born remained sacred, a place of pure water and quiet reverence. Thus the sea god, who once stood in a room of chains begging for fairness, who had children from goddesses and mortals alike, who stirred desire and wrath, who raced with Nereids and mourned his change, remained a figure of depth and storm, of tenderness and force, known not only for his trident or his earthquakes, but for his strange and shifting loves, etched wherever in the swirling seas, the golden islands, and the spiral shell that glows, faintly beneath the surface, untouched and eternal. In Corcyra, a strange event began to unfold near the sea. Every day, a bull from the pastures, leaving behind the cows, would wander down toward the shoreline, where it stood and bellowed loudly into the wind and waves. This was not a one-time occurrence, but something that continued day after day, drawing the attention of the herdsman who watched over the animal. Curious about this odd behavior, the herdsman finally followed the bull all the way down to the edge of the sea. There, he witnessed a remarkable sight: countless tunny fish gathering in the waters just off the shore, a shimmering mass of life swirling beneath the surface. The news spread quickly, and soon the people of Corcyra came to see the phenomenon for themselves. Yet, despite their efforts, their attempts to catch the fish were met with failure. The shoals remained elusive, just out of reach, their silver bodies slipping through nets and swimming away before the catch could be secured. Frustrated and confused, the people decided to send envoys to the oracle at Delphi to ask for divine guidance. Upon receiving the oracle's answer, they sacrificed the very bull that had led them to the shore, offering it to the god of the sea. No sooner had the sacrifice been made than their luck changed. The fish were caught in great numbers, filling their nets, and in gratitude they gave a tithe of the bounty to the gods, dedicating offerings at both Olympia and Delphi, marking the occasion with reverence and joy. And thus, the god's power was acknowledged not only in storms and waves, but in the mysterious behavior of animals and the blessings of abundance. Elsewhere, in tales of fishermen casting their nets into the open sea, there was a shared understanding passed from generation to generation, that when the tunny fish were safely trapped within the nets, it was time to lift hands in prayer, not to chance or skill, but to the God who ruled the ocean depths. They called him by a name that meant averter of disaster, and they prayed that no swordfish would cut through the netting, and no dolphins would dive in to chase the catch into ruin. For these creatures, swift and strong, could tear open the fisherman's work in seconds. The prayers were urgent and full of hope, asking the brother of the sky god to keep the sea calm and the fish plentiful. It was not only in storms or tempests that the god's presence was feared, but in the small moments too, in the cast of a net, in the harvest of the sea, and in the waiting silence just before the pool. In the city of Athens, the presence of the sea god was woven deeply into the very stones of the land. The city itself rose from a rock in the middle of a plain, surrounded by homes and temples, and standing above them all was the Acropolis. A poet once wrote of seeing this place and noting the mark of the god's trident still visible upon the stone. It was a reminder of an old contest, when the gods competed to win the heart of the city. One brought forth an olive tree, the other struck the ground with his trident and made water rise from the rock. That mark remained through the ages, carved into the earth like a silent echo of divine rivalry. Not far from the temple of the goddess of grain stood a statue of the sea god, shown on horseback, throwing his spear with power and force toward the giant who once threatened the gods. Though stories differed about the statue's identity, some said it was the very same god, caught in a moment of battle, with the waves crashing and strength shining in stone. High on the Areopagus, the god of the sea was shown alongside the goddess of wisdom. She stood, showing the olive branch, symbol of peace and prosperity. He was there too, presenting the wave, rising and curling, a sign of the ocean's power. Their rivalry was frozen in form, so future generations would never forget the struggle for the city's name. In another sacred space, the Erechtheion, the god had an altar. Inside its double-structured halls were altars not only to him, but also to the ancient hero who shared his lineage, to another son of the earth, and to the god of fire. But the most mysterious part of the building was a cistern that held seawater despite the city's inland location. This well was not remarkable simply for its presence, for other cities had such things, but for the sound it made. When the south wind blew, the water within the cistern would roar like the sea itself, echoing through the stone chambers like waves crashing on a distant shore. And above it, etched into the very rock, was the shape of a trident. It was said that these marks were left during the divine contest, proof of the god's rightful claim, a sign that the ground itself had once responded to his touch. This mixture of sea and land, of wind and stone, of echo and silence, held his legacy in Athens. Though he did not win the contest for the city, his presence remained. It lived in the roar beneath the floor, in the deep well that whispered with the sound of the sea, in the statues and altars, in the sacred contests, and in the very shape of the ground. It was remembered not only in prayers and sacrifices, but in daily life, in the creak of a ship's mast, in the cry of a gull, in the trembling of the earth, and in the taste of salt on the wind. His cults stretched across cities and shores, in the islands and the mainland, in sacred groves and rocky cliffs, in quiet springs and roaring surf. People honored him with bulls and fish, with horses and songs, with statues and games, and in return they asked for calm seas, strong ships, healthy animals, and steady ground. Whether in fear or in thanks, his name was always close. Also pointed out was a place not far from the city, known as the Hill of Horses, a site remembered by tradition as the first point in the land that Oedipus reached when he came into Attica. Though this version of his journey differs from the one told by the poet of old, it remained a tale carried by the people of the region. At this hill stood an altar to the god of the sea, honored here under his title as the horse god, and beside him the goddess of wisdom, likewise worshipped as the horse goddess. Nearby stood a small chapel, not only to these deities, but also dedicated to heroes, those who had shaped myth and memory, Peirithous and the slayer of the Minotaur, Oedipus and Adrastos, each remembered through names and statues, resting together under the same sky. But time would not always treat these sacred places gently. The grove and the temple of the sea god in this region were burned when a ruler named Antigonos marched into Attica. During his invasions, he brought fire and ruin, and even the sanctuaries that had stood for generations were not spared from the destruction he left behind. Elsewhere, in the land of Mantinia in Arcadia, there was an old legend that within the god's sanctuary, seawater would mysteriously rise in waves. This tale echoed one told by the Athenians themselves, who said a similar sea surge could be heard or seen upon the Acropolis. And yet, the sea itself lay 20 stades away, near Phaleron, making the phenomenon even more curious and wondrous. In the village of Lachiadae, a small parish close to the great city, there stood a sanctuary dedicated to the goddess of grain and her daughter, but within that same space, both the goddess of wisdom and the sea god were worshipped as well. Their names were joined with offerings and rituals their presence shared among the same sacred ground. In another part of Attica, the town of Eleusis, known far and wide for the secret rites held there, kept a temple for the god, where he was honored with the title of Father, Poseidon Patros. He was remembered here not only as Lord of the Sea, but as a paternal figure, bound to the land and its people in ways deeper than surface worship. Further to the south, in the lands of Corinthia, there were other stories tied to him. The people of Corinth told how he had once argued with the sun god over possession of their land. This dispute was settled not by combat, but by judgment, for the mighty Briareos, one of the old 100-handed beings, was chosen as arbitrator. Briareos ruled in favor of the sea god, granting him the isthmus and its surrounding parts, while the high ground above the city was awarded to the sun. From that day onward, the isthmus belonged to the god of the sea, and it was there that his presence became strongest. In the city of Corinth itself, many reminders of his favor remained. 2 harbors bore the names of his sons, Lecus and Kencrias, who were said to be born from his union with the nymph Peirene. One tale said Peirene was the daughter of Achilles. Another claimed she came from Oibalos. But whichever story was believed, her sons gave their names to the waters that served the city's ships at Lycaon. A sanctuary had been built in his name, and a bronze image of him stood facing the harbor, a guardian of waves and safe passage. At Kenkroi, another bronze image rose upon the mole, reaching out into the sea as if for watching the tides and waiting for returning sailors. Along the road that led from Corinth to Lycaon, there was another sacred group of statues, 3 figures arranged together, depicting the god of the sea, the goddess Leucothea, and the child Palaemon, all riding a dolphin through the spray. These statues captured a story of rescue, transformation, and mercy, bound together in one harmonious shape. Within the city, there were many places where water brought both healing and comfort, for the Corinthians had built baths in numerous quarters. Some were raised through public effort, others through imperial favor, and the most renowned of them all stood close to the god's image. This particular bath had been built by a man from Sparta named Eurycles, who adorned it with stones from many regions, but favored most of all the green-veined marble quarried from the lands of Laconia. At the entrance of this bath, a statue of the god welcomed those who entered, a figure of calm strength carved in shining stone. And beyond him stood the goddess of the hunt, depicted mid-stride, bow in hand, always chasing, never still. These places and statues, the groves and baths, the temples and wells, all bore witness to the deep presence of the god who ruled the sea, shook the earth, and shaped the lands that stretched from Athens to the Isthmus. His worship lived in the high hills and the low, harbors in waves that whispered stories and in stones that kept their marks. Through fire and invasion, through judgment and peace, his name remained etched in altar and echo, in water and wind, in marble and myth. And the festival held in Corinthos, known as the Isthmian Games, was dedicated to the god of the sea, an event celebrated with great honor and seen as one of the 4 great athletic festivals of ancient Greece, alongside the games of Olympia for the sky god, the contests of Nemea, and the musical and athletic competitions of Delphi. These games, ancient in origin, were filled with rituals and contests held in the god's name, bringing together athletes, poets, musicians, and craftsmen from across the land. Among the early poetic fragments, it was said that when the descendants of elites born from the heroic line gathered to celebrate the sea god. They crowned their victors not with pine as in older days, but with wild celery, a plant chosen to mark triumph at this sacred gathering. This festival, older even than others in memory, became a mark of pride and a place of rivalry, especially when compared to the honors given at Nemea, where similar crowns were once worn. But here, under the shadow of the god of waves and earth-shaking storms, it was celery that symbolized victory. The temple of the god stood near the narrowest part of the land bridge called the Isthmus, close to a place known as Skoinos, and even nearer to the path called the Dioklos, the track that linked sea to sea. From the harbour of Kenkre, one could journey past this narrow stretch, through groves and open paths, to find the temple nestled among pine trees. It was in that shaded grove that the people of Corinth gathered to hold the games in full celebration, the scent of pine mingling with sea air, and the crowds filling the sacred grounds. This place, sacred and central, was not just the location of sport, but of deep veneration. The sanctuary itself was said to belong wholly to the sea god. Within this sanctuary were many wonders worth seeing, including a theatre where people sat to watch, to listen, to cheer. Nearby stood a racecourse, white in its marble construction, where the feet of runners once beat against the ground, racing for glory under the god's gaze. Inside the sanctuary, statues stood in silent pride, figures of athletes who had won their contests at the Isthmian Games, their likenesses carved to endure the passing of years. Alongside these statues grew rows of pine trees, tall and straight, as if guarding the legacy of the god whose name they honored. The temple itself, though not large, carried within its walls the weight of devotion. Upon its roof stood bronze figures of tritones, the half-fish spirits of the sea who served the god and accompanied him through the waves. Within the fore-temple, more images awaited, two of the god himself, another of his queen, and one of the sea personified as a goddess. These statues were made not of stone, but of bronze, strong and shining. Among the treasures inside were offerings not from the distant past, but from more recent times, given by a man named Herodes of Athens. His gifts included 4 horses crafted in gleaming gold, with hooves of ivory. Beside them stood 2 tritones, also partly of ivory, their gold scales glinting in the light. Upon the chariot they guarded were images of the god and his consort, posed with regal stillness, and between them stood the young sea spirit Palaemon, balanced upon the back of a dolphin, as if riding the waves even within the walls of stone. These too were fashioned from ivory and gold, symbols of both luxury and piety. Beneath this chariot base, more scenes had been carved. There was Thalassa, the embodiment of the sea itself, holding up the young goddess of love as she rose from the water, and around her danced the sea nymphs, the daughters of the deep known as Nereides, each a figure of flowing grace. Also among the carvings were the twin saviours of ships and sailors, the sons of Tyndareus, whose presence among the god's companions showed how deeply the sea and safety were tied in worship. Other images included Calm, a peaceful spirit of the waters, the sea itself again, carved with depth and form, and a curious creature shaped like a horse from the head to the chest, but below the waist taking the form of a whale, a tribute to the creatures of myth and ocean alike. Alongside them were Ino, once a mortal queen, who became the goddess of white sea foam, and Bellerophontes, the slayer of beasts, riding the winged horse Pegasus, who had leapt from the blood of a Gorgon and flown through countless legends. These offerings, sculptures, carvings, and dedications filled the sanctuary not just with beauty, but with memory. They told of contests, of victories, of divine unions, and of mythic births. They reminded all who entered that the god of the sea was not just a distant force in the waters, but a presence rooted in the land, honored by athletes, poets, and kings. Within the enclosure on the left side, more could be found, but even these fragments alone showed the devotion poured out upon this ground, where sea and earth met, and where the god who commanded both was worshipped through races, songs, statues, and crowns of green. The Isthmian Games, held in his honor, were more than sport. They were a celebration of strength, endurance, and the bond between land, sea, and sky. And all of it stood under the watchful eyes of the one who could calm the waves or shake the mountains, whose temple rested among pines, and whose name was spoken with both reverence and awe. That the sacred weight of curses and oaths lingered across generations, shaping the way men honored gods and remembered the wrongs committed under divine watch. In the land near the sea where the games were held, there stood a temple dedicated to a young god of the waves, one born of the sea and raised by the gods. Within this temple stood images carved with care, one of the god of the sea himself, another of the woman who once leapt from cliffs into foam and was later named a protector of sailors, and one of the boy who had become a symbol of mercy and salvation in stormy waters. This temple also held a place known only to the initiated, a sacred chamber called the Holy of Holies, where an underground path led to a secret descent said to be the hidden resting place of the young sea god. Those who entered this place and swore falsely, whether they were of the city or strangers from afar, were believed to be caught by their oath, unable to escape the truth. Beside this hallowed structure stood another, much older altar, dedicated not to Olympian gods, but to ancient beings of primal strength, the builders of walls and masters of fire. Here sacrifices were made to those ancient ones, the Cyclopes, in quiet reverence of their old power. Nearby lay the grave of a clever man known for his wit and endless punishment, and also the grave of a son of the sea god, one who journeyed to the city, fell ill, and was buried near the narrow stretch of land where two seas met. These graves, long undisturbed, were silent witnesses to the flow of history, to the myths sung by poets and carved in stone. But not all the stories of this sacred place were about honor and peace. There was a tale passed down through generations, explaining why the people of one land never sent athletes to the great games of the Isthmus, and why, in return, the people of Corinth never appeared at the grand contests held at the Western Sanctuary. In a time of war, when a strong hero waged battle against a proud king, the twin sons of a noble house, known for their unmatched strength and valor, stood in defense of their land. They were never defeated, always turning the tide of battle with their courage. But during the time of a sacred truce declared by the hosts of the games, they arrived as envoys to honor the peace. It was then that the hero, hiding his wrath, set an ambush at a place between the cities and took their lives in secret. For a time, no one knew who had done this, but one among the mourners, their mother, grieved deeper than all others and sought the truth without rest. When she had last discovered who was responsible, the people of her land sought justice from the city where the killer had once lived, but were refused. They then turned to the hosts of the games, begging that the people from that city be banned from the contests. But again, their pleas were denied. So the grieving mother cursed her people, declaring that if they would not stand in protest, then they should never again enter the sacred grounds of the festival. Her words were heeded, and from that time on, no athlete from her land dared to compete in the games of the Isthmus. Yet this was not the only tale told to explain the absence. Another account said that in a later age, a powerful ruler from the city of Corinth had crafted an image of the sky god in gold and sent it to the Western Sanctuary as an offering. But before he could inscribe his name upon it, death came to him. The people of his city, wishing to honor him, asked permission to mark the statue with the name of their homeland. The keepers of the sanctuary refused. Angered, the people declared that those from the west should be barred from their own games. Yet this raised a question. How could they join in the Western Games if they had shut out their hosts from the Isthmian ones? Still another tale told of a nobleman from the west whose 2 sons were strong and eager to compete. They traveled to the Isthmus, entered the games of the youth, and were ready to fight with honor. But before they could step into the arena, they were slain, perhaps strangled, perhaps in some other dark way, by their rivals. When their mother learned of this crime, her grief turned to rage, and she called down curses upon her people, declaring that if they had any honor, they should never again send sons to die in the shadow of the god of the sea. This story, like the others, explained the absence, but above all, it reminded all who heard it of the power of grief, of curses spoken by those who lost everything, and of how even the gods themselves seemed to respect such solemn words. Thus, the land of the Isthmus, sacred to the god of the sea, was filled not only with temples and statues, but with stories and silence, with curses and oaths, with the long echo of footsteps from those who came to compete and those who came no more. Every altar, every grave, every statue told part of this long and winding tale, a tale of rivalry, of loyalty, of love, and of loss, stretching from the depths of the sea to the marble racecourses, from secret tombs to high platforms where crowns of celery or pine marked the victors. Even the winds that blew over the sacred grounds seemed to whisper the names of those who once walked there. Some cheered in triumph, others mourned in shadow. And beneath it all, the god of the sea watched, his name carved into stone, his voice in the waves, his presence forever tied to the narrow land that joined 2 worlds, neighboring cities who shared the care of the sanctuary, binding their allegiance through common worship of the god of the sea. These cities, tied together by sacred custom, met in reverence at the island shrine where Poseidon was honored not only as lord of the waves, but also as a guardian of law and assembly. And so it was that this island, once exchanged by divine bargain, became a center of peace and worship in the lands around. In another corner of this region, further inland, the city of Argos bore its own memory of Poseidon. There, a sanctuary stood to the god who had once sent a flood upon the lands, angry at the judgment of the river Inachos and his allies who declared the land belonged not to him, but to another. In his fury, Poseidon had caused the waters to rise, drowning much of the land, until the sea was only calmed again through divine persuasion. Where the flood finally receded, the people of the land built a sanctuary and called him by a name that remembered the flood. They honored him, even though the tide had once risen by his will, marking the spot where the water pulled away, leaving the earth behind in peace. Beyond Argos and its hills, near the roads that wound toward the harbor once known by the Sicyonians, another sanctuary rose, a quiet place just above the traveler's path, where offerings were made beneath open sky to the god of the Isthmus. Nearby, in the city of Sicyon itself, not far from the hero's resting place, stood another altar, simple but respected, bearing his name and title. There, too, the sea god was remembered in connection with the narrow land between the 2 gulfs, where his name had long been spoken alongside contests and festivals Even in the city of Cenchreae, on the southern coast of the Isthmus, the presence of Poseidon was felt. There the temple of the god watched over the waters, and every 4 years the city would come alive for the games held in his name. These contests, counted among the 4 greatest in all of Greece, brought athletes from many lands, and though the games were full of struggle and triumph, they were held with deep reverence, as offerings to the one whose power stirred the sea. The tradition was so widely respected that even distant Roman authors noted the site as famous for its recurring honors to the god of the sea. Further west, in Elis, there once lived a man named Temon, whose strength and skill in the fivefold contest brought him crowns in many places. At Olympia, a statue stood in his likeness, bearing inscriptions of the victories he had won. But among these honors, one contest was missing. There was no crown from the Isthmian Games, and the reason, carved in elegiac verse, pointed to a shadow of the past, a quarrel about the cursed deaths of the sons of Actor, which kept the athlete from ever stepping into the land ruled by the memory of Sisyphos. Each of these places, scattered across southern Greece, kept a story tied to the name of the sea god. From Argos to Sicyon, from Troezen to the harbours below, altars rose, tales were told, and ancient memory carried his image in stone and voice. In one place, the sanctuary of Poseidon stood with statues of gods and goddesses upon dolphins, images of sea creatures and sacred horses that sprang from the waves. In another, a harbour shrine overlooked the sea, silent but steadfast, marking the reverence of generations. In the city streets and on mountain paths, the god's presence was known by both joy and wrath, celebrated in games, honoured in temples, remembered in curses and songs. There was also the tale of the land flooded by divine rage, the very earth itself judged unfit for possession. When the decision did not favour Poseidon, he sent the waves crashing inland, reclaiming with salt what had been declared as belonging to another. And yet, when the waters receded, it was not with malice that the people remembered him, but with awe, building a place to remember both his anger and his return to calm. Even in myth, when gods bartered lands like gifts, the names of cities and islands bore the memory of their divine exchanges. Troezen was once called by Poseidon's name, and on its shores stood Pogum, a harbour looking out to Calaurea, the island once offered in trade for Delos. There a league was formed among cities, a bond of worship and shared service to the god whose power moved both water and assembly. These places, with their ancient stones and sacred groves, held the memory of more than just offerings. They told of the way cities grew, under the watch of the sea god, of how paths and temples followed the lines of his favour or his fury. From the Isthmian Games to harbour sanctuaries, from flood legends to exchanges of land among the divine, the god of the sea was never far from the lives of those who lived near water or within reach of the coast. And though his domain stretched across oceans and waves, it was in these lands of southern Greece, on hills, in cities, at harbours, and near sacred altars, that his stories were carved deepest into the earth. 7 cities took part in the ancient shared sacrifice, bound together by reverence and long tradition. These cities were Hermione, Epidaurus, Aegina, Athens, Prasies, Nauples, and Orchomenos Minyaeos. Yet not all contributed on their own. Some paid on behalf of others. The Argives paid the dues for the Nauplians, and the Lacedaemonians for the Prasians, keeping the chain of worship unbroken. The god they honoured was so deeply woven into the life of the land that even the powerful Macedonians, who had expanded their reach as far as the sacred precinct, dared not violate its sanctity. They hesitated to seize those who fled to Calaurea, for refuge, showing that even when strength ruled, the old gods still held sway. It was during the reign of a mythical king that the story unfolded of how two deities, Athena and the god of the sea, disputed ownership of the land. After argument, they obeyed the command of the king of the gods and held the land in common. Because of this, the people honored both deities equally, giving Athena the names Polias, meaning she who protects the city, and Sirthanius, meaning strong one, while the god of the sea was called Basileus, or king. Even their coins reflected this balance, bearing a trident and the face of the goddess. As time passed, the people forgot the names of later kings, but they remembered Hyperes and Anthus, who were said to be sons of the sea god and of a daughter of Atlas. These two were believed to have founded the ancient cities of Hyperia and Anthea in the surrounding land. Outside the city walls stood a sanctuary of the god under the title Phytalmios, the nurturer. The tale behind the name told how, once angered, the god had made the land barren. Salt from the sea brought up from beneath the ground poisoned seeds and roots alike, choking life from the soil. But through sacrifices and prayers, his wrath was softened, and the brine no longer rose. Fertility returned, and with it the people's gratitude, etched into the ground through worship. Across the sea, the island of Calaurea was once sacred to another god, Mizol, but legend told of a divine exchange in which the two deities traded their sacred homes. One took Delphoi, the other Calaurea. The saying lived on, spoken with respect. Delos and Calaurea alike thou lovest to dwell in, Pytho too, the holy, and Tainaran, swept by the high winds. And on Calaurea still stood the god's holy sanctuary, where a maiden served as priestess, until she reached the age when marriage called her away. Further south, beyond the island of Hydria, the land curved along a crescent-shaped beach, leading to a narrow stretch ending in a sanctuary. This bit of land began at the eastern sea and ran west, home to harbours and the memory of a former city. Though the people had since moved inland, they kept their ancient sanctuaries, chief among them, one to the god of the sea, standing at the edge where land met waves. In the town of Hermione, close to that headland, more memories endured. The people still told the stories, still tended the shrines, still looked out to the sea with the knowledge that its god, powerful and unpredictable, watched over them. Whether through sacred coin, shared sacrifice, trembling earth, or calm harbour, the presence of the sea god remained, steady as the waves he ruled. And so, across cities and islands, through legends and rituals, the god was honoured, king of the depths, nurturer of soil, sender of salt and bringer of rain, keeper of covenants, and guardian of sanctuaries too ancient to forget. The sanctuary of the god stood upon land that at first appeared flat, a peaceful stretch of earth that slowly began to rise and slope, gently climbing until it merged with the base of a mountain known as Pran. Here in the region of Hermione, the image of the god was cast in bronze, majestic and powerful, with one foot confidently resting upon the curved back of a dolphin, a reminder of his rule over the seas and the creatures within it. Not far away, in a village called Philanorion, there were temples dedicated not only to him but also to Apollon and Demeter, three deities each honoured with upright statues made of white marble, standing side by side, radiant in their simplicity and strength. Farther on, in Temenium, another village within the same region, there was yet another sanctuary built for him, solemn and enduring, standing as testimony to the widespread reverence for the god of the sea. In Nauplia, a city now abandoned, ruins of walls still clung to the earth, whispering of its founder, Nauplios, said to be born of the god Anamimene. Even there, in the silence left behind by people, a sanctuary to the god still stood, holding its ground like the tide that never forgets to return. Following the coast from Lerna, the road led to a small place by the sea called Genesion, where a tiny sanctuary of the god called Genesios faced the waters. In the land of Arcadia, after one crossed over Mount Artemisius into the Mantinean country, there stretched a broad plain that bore the name the Untilled Plain. It was a place where no farmer's plough had touched the soil, for waters from the surrounding mountains ran down into it, soaking it until it could bear no crops. This plain might have become a lake if not for a mysterious chasm in the earth into which the water vanished, swallowed without a trace. That hidden stream re-emerged again in Argolis, at a place known as Dyne, or Whirlpool, where sweet fresh water rose up out of the salty sea. This spot, Genethlion, was sacred to the god, and in older times people of Argos threw horses, beautifully adorned with bridles, into the depths as offerings to the one they believed had power over both land and sea. In the region of Lake Damonia, deep in the southern reaches of Greece, stood the powerful city of Sparta. Not far from its bustling markets, there was a sanctuary for the god under the title Asphalios, the Securer, a protector of safety and stability. On the Aphitad road, beyond a place called Bidii, there stood a precinct for the god bearing the name Tainarios, connecting him to the far-reaching headland that bore the same title. In another part of the city lay the tomb of a man named Tainaros, and there too rose sanctuaries dedicated to the god under the name Hippokurios, meaning horse tending, a gentle reminder that he ruled not just over storm and sea, but also over the noble creatures of the land. Nearby, Artemis was honored under the name Aeginaia, linked to the wild goat, and her presence stood beside his, as if the sea and wilderness met at the city's edge. In yet another part of Sparta, beside the shrine of a figure called Alcon, there was a temple for the god under a new name, Dometites, meaning of the house, where his domain extended into the quiet safety of home. Not far from the grand theatre of the city, another shrine honored him again, this time under the name Genethlios, the god of kin, as if to anchor him even in the heart of human bloodlines and family. Through city and village, field and shore, peak and plain, the god's sanctuaries continued to rise. Each place bore his presence under different names, each one marking a different side of his nature: king, nurturer, securer, horse tender, lord of homes, and kin. He stood in bronze with a dolphin beneath him. He stood in marble beside Demeter. He rose beside whirlpools and within the bounds of ruined cities, in ancient plains and sacred coastal spits, where land met the vast whispering sea. The god was remembered and worshipped, not only as ruler of waves, but as a god who belonged everywhere the earth met water, and in all the hidden places in between. In the bronze house of the goddess in Sparta, great images were crafted, and among them stood the scenes depicting the birth of the goddess of wisdom, the sea queen, and the lord of the ocean himself. These were not merely carved in passing detail, but they were the largest of all the works, and considered by many to be the most remarkable to see, shining examples of artistry and devotion. Not far from the village of Therapne in the same region stood a sanctuary dedicated to the god, here known by the name that meant Earth Embracer, a title that spoke of his power not only over the waves, but also in holding the very ground firm beneath the people's feet. Further on, near the town of Aegae, there was a lake that bore the god's name, and beside it, a temple was built with an image of him. Yet, the people feared disturbing the waters, believing that anyone who dared to fish there would be cursed to become like the fish called the fisher, a legend told again and again by those who passed the quiet banks. In the village of Cathian, there was yet another statue of the god, again bearing the title Earth Embracer, solidifying his presence across the region as one who held sway over both the shaking ground and the ever-shifting sea. In Boyai, near the point of Malaya, there was a harbour called Nymphaeon, where another statue of the sea god stood near a cave. Inside that cave, right by the sea's edge, was a spring that flowed with fresh, sweet water. A rare gift where salt met stone. Farther still, the land curved outward into a headland called Tainaron, a stretch of the earth that projected boldly into the sea. Here, in a grove, was a temple dedicated to him, and the place was known for its sacred quiet. The structure of the temple was like a cave, natural and dark, and in front of it stood another statue of the god, solemn and watchful. This place was once marked by a terrible moment. Some condemned men had fled to this very sanctuary, clinging to the altar for safety, placing their hope in the old law that no one could be harmed while in the god's sacred space. But those in power ignored the ancient rule, dragged the men from the altar and killed them. The wrath of the god was not delayed. The city that had allowed this sacrilege was punished with fierce anger, and an earthquake struck with such force and continuity that no home in the city could withstand it. Everything fell, shattered by a force that seemed to rise from deep beneath the earth, and the lesson was not forgotten. Another telling of the same tale said that when these fugitives were murdered at the temple of Tainaron, the earth itself trembled with such fury that it seemed to tear through the very foundation of the land, toppling every dwelling in its path, showing the god's power in its rawest form. In the nearby land of Messenia, in the city of Messene, there were sanctuaries for both the god of the sea and the goddess of love, standing side by side, a union of water and desire. And in the wide lands of Elise, it was said that the whole countryside was dotted with temples dedicated to the sea god, built on many of the capes where land met open water. In Olympia, the famed ground of the sacred games, stood a starting point for the chariot races. There, just about the middle of the course, were open altars for the sea god under the name Horse God, and for the goddess Hera, who was also honored as a protector of horses. Their shared guardianship over the swift and strong creatures was remembered each time the chariots thundered past the altars. In these scattered but powerful ways, the sea god's presence was constant, stretching from the towering mountain slopes of Sparta to the carved shores of distant capes, from the quiet lakes where no one dared to fish to the windswept headlands where springs of fresh water bubbled beside caves. He was honored in temples both grand and small, and his wrath remembered in trembling ground and rising seas, in statues that stood firm before sacred groves, and in sanctuaries where mortals whispered prayers and made offerings. He remained both feared and revered. From the quiet countryside of Elis to the earthquake-shaken streets of ancient Lake Daimon, from hidden springs in coastal caves to the altars beside thunderous racetracks, the worship of the sea god echoed through the land and across generations, as solid and vast as the waves he ruled. At Olympia, among the many sacred places where gods were honored, there stood an altar that was shared between the one called Zeus of the people and the one known as the Lord of the Sea. This place of offering was not set aside for one god alone, but brought both together in worship, showing how closely the powers of the heavens and the deep were held by the people who gathered there. It was also believed by many that the strange and unsettling presence felt on the racecourse, the one that caused horses to panic and bolt, came not from a wandering spirit or ghost, but was simply another name given to the sea god in his form as the horse lord. The idea was that his power over horses, especially those in motion and in contests of speed, might explain the fear that overcame them at that spot on the track. This name, the Frightener of Horses, became tied to his worship at Olympia, where chariot races were a vital part of the games. Beyond Olympia, in the region of Elis, there rose the mountain lands of Triphylia, and there nestled a place called Samicum. Here stood what was considered the most deeply honored temple of the sea god in that area, a sacred space known as the Temple of the god Samios. This temple did not stand alone, but was encircled by a precinct filled with wild olive trees, their twisting branches and sturdy trunks giving shade and forming a natural wall around the holy ground. The care of this temple fell to the people of a place called Makiston, who were responsible for tending to its needs and guarding its traditions. They also proclaimed the special day of peace, known as the Armistice of Samian, a time when fighting ceased and people came together to show respect and make offerings. Yet even though the people of Makiston were the ones who looked after the site, the entire region of Triphylia took part in its maintenance, joining their efforts to keep the temple in good order and the rituals alive. Elsewhere in the same land, between a city called Leprion and a river known as the Anios, there was another site dedicated to the god of the sea. This temple too bore the name Samios and was known for its location, standing at an equal distance, 100 stadia, from both Leprion and the river, set above the seashore. This was the place spoken of in the old stories, where it was said that the young traveller Telemachus once arrived and found the people offering sacrifice to the god. They stood on the beach, close to the rolling waves, and there they slew bulls that were entirely black in colour, giving them as a gift the one they called the Earth Shaker, a name that reminded all of the god's power to send tremors through the land as easily as he could stir the waters. Those who support this story say that it places the home of Nestor, the wise elder of old tales, in the Triphylian version of Pylos, instead of the southern city also called by that name. Nearby, there was another sacred area known simply as the Poseidon, a name that marked it as belonging to the sea god. This sanctuary stood near the sea, its location chosen so that the sound of waves might be heard as the wind moved through the air and offerings were made. Above it, looking down from a height, rose a steep hill that lay in front of what remained of Samicum as it existed in later days. On that hill, in earlier times, there had once been a town named Samos, a place so hidden from the sea that those sailing along the coast could not catch sight of it. It was this concealment that allowed the sanctuary below to remain quiet and undisturbed, a place of calm where people came with gifts and prayers. Each of these places told a part of the long story of devotion to the god of the sea, the Earth Shaker, the Lord of Horses. From the altars in Olympia, where he shared honors with the ruler of the sky, to the sacred grove at Samicum guarded by olive trees and cared for by an entire region, to the beachside temples where black bulls were offered up under the open sky, to the hidden hills where forgotten cities once stood and looked down upon waters sacred to the god. His worship was strong and spread wide. The people who lived in these lands did not merely build shrines and offer sacrifices. They arranged their festivals, their treaties, even their periods of peace around the cycles of worship tied to him. They feared his anger, which could shake the ground or unnerve horses at full gallop. but they also trusted his protection over their lands, seas, and cities. In every place his name was spoken, whether in great cities or quiet mountain settlements. He was known not only as the ruler of the waves, but as a powerful presence whose temple stood close to the sea, surrounded by groves, near rivers, and beneath hills that remembered the ancient days. Through stories, rituals, and sacred spaces, the memory of the sea god lived on, holding a firm place in the hearts and traditions of all who dwelled along the land's edge.